What happens when a seasoned journalist, armed with a sharpened tongue and a hidden agenda, squares off against a newly minted vice president who refuses to bend? On a blazing stage under the scrutiny of millions, the trap is set. But the prey turns predator in a stunning reversal that no one sees coming. Before we plunge into this electrifying showdown, take a moment to share in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'd love to know who's joining me for this wild ride. Now, imagine the scene. Studio lights flood one of America's most watched talk shows with an unrelenting glare, illuminating every bead of sweat, every flicker of doubt. The air hums with electric anticipation as J.D. Vance, the freshly inaugurated vice president, strides onto the set, his oath of office still echoing in the nation's ears. With the poise of a man forged in hardship and honed by service, Vance carries a quiet confidence, an unshakable belief that truth needs no apology. Yet, across from him sits Marcus Bennett, the show's host, a man whose reputation for slicing through guests with surgical precision precedes him. Tonight, Bennett has a mission, and it's not the polite policy chat his producer promised. Bennett, a liberal firebrand with a smirk that could curdle milk, has spent weeks plotting this moment. His research team has dug into Vance's past, unearthing every old quote, every shift in stance, like prospectors panning for gold in a river of controversy. As Vance settles into the guest chair, the usual small talk feels like a formality rushed through a meat grinder. Bennett's smile is a thin veneer, his eyes glinting with the thrill of the hunt. The production crew shifts uneasily behind the cameras, their hushed whispers betraying a tension thicker than the studio's soundproof walls. Vance, a former Marine with instincts sharpened by combat, senses the ambush brewing. Every nerve tells him Bennett's questions are grenades, polished to look like softballs, their pins already half pulled. The opening salvo comes cloaked in honeyed tones. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett begins, his voice dripping with faux warmth, "let's explore your remarkable journey, from a vocal critic of President Trump to his trusted second-in-command. Quite the transformation, wouldn't you say?" He clutches his note cards so tightly his knuckles blanch, a tell Vance doesn't miss. With a steady gaze and a smile tempered by years of hard-earned wisdom, Vance leans into the moment. "You know, Marcus, that's a fantastic place to begin," he says, his tone as calm as a still lake. "Because it's not just about me. It's about something grander. It's about America's capacity to evolve, to embrace new perspectives when the evidence demands it." The audience tilts forward in their seats, caught off guard by the absence of a defensive crouch. Bennett squirms, his meticulously rehearsed follow-up suddenly wobbling like a house of cards in a breeze. "Evolve?" Bennett scoffs, his voice sharpening with mockery. "Is that what we're calling it these days? Some might say it's just political opportunism dressed up as enlightenment." His words are a jab, meant to draw blood, but Vance doesn't flinch. "Here's the thing, Marcus," he replies, his voice even as granite. "In America, we cherish the freedom to change our minds when the facts shift. Back when I criticized the president, I saw the world through a narrower lens, one shaped by headlines and hearsay. But then I saw something extraordinary. His policies lifting up the very people I wrote about in my book, the forgotten Americans left behind by decades of neglect." For a fleeting second, Bennett's mask slips, his jaw tightening as Vance presses on. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. Have you ever reconsidered a belief? Looked at the evidence and admitted your first take might have missed the mark?" The question hangs like smoke in the air. Bennett hesitates, a beat too long, before snapping, We're here to discuss your shifts, Mr. Vice President, not mine. He shuffles his cards with a touch of desperation, eager to regain the offensive. Speaking of shifts, he pivots, let's talk about your speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You claimed divine guidance has a role in government decisions. Don't you think that's a perilous blend of church and state? The audience stiffens. Bennett has just stepped onto a tightrope stretched over sacred ground. A spark flares in Vance's eyes. He's been waiting for this. Divine guidance, Marcus? Vance leans forward, his voice rich with conviction. What I said was that our founding fathers understood leadership demands a moral compass. They didn't fear faith, they feared tyranny. A murmur of Amen ripples through the crowd, soft but undeniable. Bennett's jaw clenches as he counters. But surely, in our modern, diverse society... Vance raises a hand, cutting him off with the grace of a conductor silencing an orchestra. Let me finish, because this matters, he says, firm yet respectful. When I swore my oath, I placed my hand on the Bible, just as leaders have for centuries, not to impose a religion, but to affirm that our rights stem from something greater than government whims. Bennett shoots a glance at his producer, who watches from the sidelines like a general sizing up a losing battle. Vance adds, almost casually, You know what's funny, Marcus? When I was a Marine, no one batted an eye at our chaplain's prayers before a mission. In those raw moments, even the doubters felt something bigger than themselves. The exchange deepens into a clash of worldviews, raw and unfiltered. Bennett, his face flushing, presses on. Let's shift to your ties with President Trump. You recently called him God's instrument for America's renewal. Isn't that a tad extreme? Vance doesn't blink. What's extreme, Marcus, is how some in the media fixate on a leader who prays while ignoring policies that crush American families, he says, pausing to let the words sink in. But since you mentioned Trump, let's talk results, not rhetoric. Let's talk about the jobs returning to Ohio, the hope flickering back in communities like mine since the inauguration. The studio falls into a hush, Bennett's usual barrage of interruptions stalled by Vance's unshakable calm, the host's composure phrase. Your background, Mr. Vice President. You've written about humble roots, yet here you are, perched in power's lap. Have you forgotten where you came from? Vance's eyes narrow slightly, but his voice stays steady. That's an interesting angle, Marcus, because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not how well they play the Washington game. Yes, I criticized Trump once, and you know what takes real character? Admitting you were wrong when the evidence proves it, even when folks like you spin it into a scandal. The audience hums with approval as Bennett tugs at his collar, his tone rising. You've built a reputation as a champion of the working class, yet here you sit in a tailored suit defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The room cools as a few audience members shift uncomfortably, but Vance's faint smile holds firm. What I see, Marcus, is someone who thinks a suit can rewrite a man's soul. Let me tell you something. The values I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, don't fade with a new address or a fancy title. Bennett's eyes narrow to slits. So, you're saying this transformation isn't ambition? That we should just gloss over your past attacks and accept you as Trump's new puppet? The word lands like a brick through a window, gasps rippling through the crowd. Vance's response is surgical. That word, Marcus, it says more about you than me, he says, his voice steel-wrapped in velvet. In your world, loyalty to someone you respect is a punchline. But in the Marines, I learned to judge character by actions, not headlines. I've seen Trump's heart, not the cartoon you've painted. Applause erupts, drowning Bennett's attempt to interrupt. You call it puppetry. I call it recognizing leadership. I'm proud to stand with him. Bennett tries sarcasm next. A man of your intellect must see the contradiction in backing someone you once trashed. Vance doesn't miss a beat. There you go, Marcus, hunting for contradictions instead of truth. The real contradiction is dismissing what I've witnessed just to appease critics like you. The applause thunders as Bennett's producer signals frantically. Vance isn't done. And since you mentioned intellect, he says with a wry smile, it proves wisdom isn't about spotting flaws, it's about growing from what you learn. Why don't we discuss the dishonesty in your coverage of this administration? Bennett bristles. My coverage? He snaps. Last week, Vance cuts in smoothly, you aired a segment questioning my faith, calling it election season theater. Was that journalism or a cheap shot? Bennett reddens. I was noting the timing. Timing of what? Vance interrupts. That I've attended the same church for years? Or maybe you'd question my grandmother's prayers too. She taught me faith when we barely had food on the table. A woman in the front row nods fiercely. Let me be clear, Vance continues, his voice a blend of steel and grace. Question my politics, my choices. But when you imply my faith is a prop, you're not just hitting me. You're spitting on every American who prays in earnest. Bennett scrambles for footing. Let's talk statements, like when you said supporting traditional values is living in the past. Do you think millions of church-going Americans are dinosaurs? The silence is deafening as Bennett's facade cracks. No, Marcus, Vance says. I'm trying to have a real talk about the contempt you show for everyday folks. You thought you'd shame me for my roots, my faith, my loyalty, but what really irks you is that I don't fit your mold, that I can graduate Yale Law and still hold fast to tradition. Bennett stammers, You're twisting this. No, Vance says, turning to the audience. I'm holding up a mirror. Marcus doesn't get that integrity isn't about never changing. It's about owning it when you do. I met Trump, saw his love for this country, and chose truth over pride. The American people are tired of being sneered at for their faith, their values, their love of nation. The crowd leaps to its feet, applause shaking the rafters as Bennett's ambush implodes. We're out of time, he mutters, deflated. Vance rises, facing the camera. To every American mocked for their beliefs, stand tall. Character isn't about pleasing critics, it's about staying true. As he exits to a roaring ovation, Bennett sits, a king dethroned by dignity and truth. If this tale of conviction stirred you, like and subscribe. Faith, family, freedom, they're not just words, they're America's heartbeat. God bless you, and God bless this nation.